and welcome to another installment of the Sea Realm podcast. I'm your host, KMO, and this is episode number 352, Drive, Flow, and Purpose, with guest Federico Pistono. This episode is prepared for release onto the World Wide Web on Wednesday, March 6th, 2013. In this episode of the podcast, I'll play a conversation that I recorded with Federico Pistono, the author of the book, Robots Will Steal Your Job, but That's Okay. How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy. I'll say more about that in a moment, but first I want to thank the very generous sponsors of this week's episode of the Sea Realm podcast. Sea Realm is a listener-supported program, and in the last 7 days, the following generous souls have clicked on the PayPal donate button on SeaRealm.com and sent some money my way to help offset the cost of producing the Sea Realm podcast. This week, I have to thank Float23, Chris S., and Michael C. You may recognize the name Float23. Float23 is the composer of the Sea Realm podcast theme music, which you hear playing behind me right now. I asked Float23 if he wanted me to read out a sponsorship message, and he asked that I inform the Sea Realm listenership that he's forming a new record label called MT Records. MT Records will have its label launch party this coming September in London, and simultaneous with the launch party will be a CD release. Any musical artists interested in being featured on the CD or playing at the release party should contact Float23 at info@float23.com. I will include that email address in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at SeaRealm.com. Thanks to Float23 for his generous support of the Sea Realm podcast and for the gift of his music. Thanks also to Chris and Michael. Your support means the world to me. The musical interlude on this week's show is by AU5. The track is called Singularity. Thanks to Adapted Records for permission to play the song on the Sea Realm podcast. You'll find a link to the Adapted Records website in the show notes for this episode, which you can find at SeaRealm.com. I have an announcement to make at the end of the show about an upcoming live event here in New York City, so stick around for that. But now, I'm going to read an excerpt from Robots Will Steal Your Job, but That's Okay. How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy by Federico Pistono. Federico writes, "The reality is that the new jobs created by technology employ a very small fraction of people, and even those jobs tend to disappear soon after they are created. The time when a high school education, a lot of goodwill, and hard work got you a decent middle-class lifestyle are long gone. The old jobs are not coming back. The new jobs will be highly sophisticated, technically and creatively challenging jobs, and only a handful of them will be needed. The question is simple. What will the unskilled workers of today do? So far, nobody has been able to answer that question. The reason for this, I think, is because there is no answer. Not in this system. Not in the way it is designed to work. And now, here is my conversation with Federico Pistono."
You're listening to the Sea Realm podcast. C stands for consciousness.
You are listening to the Sea Realm podcast. I'm your host, KMO, and I'm joined by Skype by Federico Pistono, who is the author of Robots Will Steal Your Job, but That's Okay. How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy. Federico Pistono, welcome to the Sea Realm podcast.
Hi, KMO. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it is my pleasure, and thank you for sending along the Mobi version of your book. I read it on my new Amazon Kindle Paperwhite. It was a very enjoyable experience.
Thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
And I am not endorsing the Paperwhite, at least I'm not paid to do so, but it is a very neat device, and it makes me feel like I'm living in the future.
Yes, sometimes we kind of forget that in some respect we already live in the future. I mean, just think about the things that we take for granted now. Communication from one side to the other side of the planet at the speed of light, instantaneous access to the sum of all human knowledge in your pocket in matter of seconds. And this is just taken for granted now. But if you had said so 10 years ago, people would have thought you were crazy. And they would say, you're just nuts. This is science fiction. This is the Jetsons. You are not being realistic. But this is the way technology works, and we adapt very quickly to rapid changes, and we get accustomed to things. We get a habit of just about anything, and then it becomes normality, and we forget about it. So it's very true.
One thing I do on this program is I let competing narratives each have their say in my consciousness and in the consciousness of the listeners who are following along. And these things can be mutually incompatible. And I talk to a lot of people about peak oil and resource depletion, limits to growth, that sort of thing. I talk to people about problems with the economic system as it stands today, the growth-based paradigm. But then I also talk to people who are what I like to call techno-utopians, people who think that technology will solve all of our problems and that it will just basically make us all into immortal gods who can do anything they want and have unlimited freedom. And your book participates in all of those, and you don't take the techno-utopian stand and at the absurd extreme that I just described, but you did go to the Singularity University, and you have been very much engaged with that community of people who are very, very optimistic about the prospects for technology and for the human future, and yet you also acknowledge the problems of the expectation for infinite growth, particularly the infinite growth in the consumption of energy. And you talk about, you actually mention peak oil by name, and you also mention, and this is what really won me over, that a lot of the techno-utopians and singularitarians do not acknowledge these very serious challenges that we face.
Indeed, that is correct. And I think it's because I was taught and I received, you could say, an education from both sides. So I was educated about the problems of society, the environment, the degrowth movement, or the happy degrowth, as we call it, because we kind of give a negative connotation to the idea of negative growth or non-growth, whether we can actually live a better, happier life by utilizing less resources in a more efficient manner. And I also received you could say the singularitarian or a techno-utopian Kool-Aid, but being skeptical of all positions, and just my personal philosophy is to look at the facts, the data, and what works. And to some people, this may seem a bit restrictive because it doesn't count, human emotions and relationships and empathy and all of that, but it actually does, because that's data as well. If you live a life that it's unfulfilling and that doesn't take into account the importance of human relationships and the psyche of people, then you are being restrictive of your vision about what's important in your life. So I see a problem with both the environmentalist by itself approach for society and the techno-utopian. And so far as any ideology goes, extreme forms of capitalism, of socialism, the free market mentality or religion, as you want to call it, I think all ideologies fall short to reality, because reality is much more complex than the models we create about it. And one of the problems that I encountered with many people is that they try to subscribe to either an ideology or a model that they make for reality. And then in face of new data, what they do is they try to fit the data into their existing ideology or model, instead of doing exactly the opposite, which is to reconstruct the model to fit the new data. And this is the approach that I try to have. So absolutely, we have massive problems with sustainability. The basis of the economic system is unsustainable, because it's based upon the idea of, as you mentioned, infinite growth paradigm, not just about energy, but energy is just one indicator of the whole. The real problem is the resources in general. Water, air, soil, fertile soil, breathable air, and so on and so forth. All the life-supporting system on the planet have been in a state of decline for the past 25 years, and this is scientific evidence. This is not ideology. And yet, we are basing all of our economic activities and hence our lives in a state of perpetual consumption and conspicuous consumption. So we don't think about the production of goods in terms of their impact on the planet and their utility for people. We just make things because we have to keep the economic engine to run and to grow. And I challenge that assumption. On the other hand, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against technology. I think technology is a wonderful tool to achieve certain goals that you have. It's an amplifier of your intentions. But as with everything, if your intentions are very bad and narrow-minded, technology will amplify those negative consequences. But if you have a good vision and a moral standard, then technology can help you leapfrog entire generations of hard work for useless things and just go forward and move in a much more accelerated way than we used to. So I kind of see the merits and the limits of both approaches, and I try to take a stance based on evidence and work on that.
Recently, on my new Amazon Kindle, I have been reading the Unabomber's Manifesto, the writings of Ted Kaczynski. Mm-hmm. And he makes a very detailed and, to me, persuasive argument that technology, the advance of technology, naturally limits human freedom, in spite of the fact that many people who are techno-optimists are also very libertarian in their philosophy, particularly libertarian from an individual freedom perspective. He says that people with the best of intentions, people who are only looking to do right by their fellow man and to fulfill their own obligations with creativity and to move through the world with style and responsibility, will make decisions which over time limit the scope of human freedom, particularly when it comes to eliminating bad behavior. And we only will direct our ability to engineer human behavior at the most extreme cases. But as we eliminate the most extreme cases which in the past weren't extreme, now are the outliers. They are now defining the far edge of the continuum of what is acceptable behavior, and so we turn our attention to those. And that one generation who grows up with a certain level of social control imposed upon them and are used to it will take it a step further, and they'll do things that their parents wouldn't have thought acceptable. And so that it's just a bit of a counterpoint to the notion that the effects of technology are dependent upon your intentions. He's making the argument that good intentions can still lead to increasing restrictions on human freedom.
Yes, I'm familiar with Ted Kaczynski's work, and it's amazing to me how somebody who did something so dreadful and something that I would never do has some very interesting and agreeable points of view in his writings. I agree that, okay, here's the thing. Societies become more complex over time, and that's because you grow in numbers, you grow in complexity, and you don't grow proportionally, you grow exponentially in terms of complexity. And some people make the point that eventually society becomes so complex that in order to manage the complexity, you will have to use basically the whole of society just to manage its complexity without any other economic activity. There are many authors who made this claim, and there are also some very interesting theories in mathematics and models making these predictions. And so as societies do become more complex, the ability for the individual to make a difference and to have an effect on society are reduced proportionally. However, at the same time, you have the potential and the capacity to also have the biggest impact. And that's kind of counterintuitive. So it's not that people don't have the ability to have an impact. It's that the old ways of having an impact become less and less relevant and less important in that kind of new, more complex society. So you have to adapt to new situations very quickly. And of course, the people who make the most harm are those who have, initially the best intentions. It's only based on their points of view. So I'm sure Hitler was, in his mind, doing something absolutely needed for humanity and wonderful. But in his twisted way of thinking, he started the eugenics movement, and then that moved to the United States. And it's just a double-edged sword of trying to do something. If nobody does anything, then nothing really bad happens. It's just, status quo going on. The problem is, I think, not having a serious approach to scientific evidence. If you look at the eugenics movement, for instance, or the teachings of any big ideology that moved the big regimes of the 19th century, they were all failing to realize the scientific evidence for their claims. So, for instance, the eugenics movement was based on a fallacious idea. It's a kind of a pseudoscience. And it's really hard to make the right choices because you never know in advance what's going to be beneficial for society. But what I think you can do is to have a direction, a sense of direction, and being able to shift, to kind of pivot every time you see something not working, and keep yourself available to new information, and try not to be stuck in a certain ideology, because that's the biggest problem. People who are stuck in their way of thinking and they're not open to changing their mindset. And if you take mental rigidity and you add a lot of power and determination, then you're going to have problems. So, but it's a very complex topic. I don't know if I'm making much sense now, but maybe we should have the discussion moving forward, and the thoughts will become more clear.
Well, you said something that's very clear. I could almost write it as an equation, which is rigid thinking plus power equals trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
I had a conversation with my friend Gary Borgeson. He's written a book called Willing Dogs and Reluctant Masters on Friendship and Dogs. And I believe you heard that conversation, or at least part of it, where we talked about the ideas in your book,
yes,
about the connection between working a job and feeling that one is justified in living. In fact, our language, the English language anyway, equates the two. You earn a living. Unless you are employed
yes,
and working, you do not have a right to live. And I wanted to just get your response to that conversation.
Yes, first of all, I have to, hats off, kudos to you. You're one of the few who actually read and understood my book. Most people who claim to have read my book, they may have read the first 50 pages and then skimmed through the rest. But you actually did go through the section on happiness, the relationship with work, and the importance of that section. Because to me, the idea of technological employment, so machines taking over, becoming better at humans at performing labor, was just the introduction to a bigger topic, which is the redefinition and the put into question of the idea of compulsory work for the sake of survival. The idea that somebody has to earn a living and somebody has to justify their existing through work, that to me seemed ludicrous, and I had to challenge that idea. However, when I looked at the scientific evidence, it showed remarkably and without any doubt that work was the single most defining factor for the long-term happiness of people. So controlling for variables, meaning you take, when you make a scientific study, you control for other variables. Are those people married? Are they in their 50s, in their 20s? Do they have this kind of degree, their social status, their family? So you control for variables. And the single most defining factors is having a job or not having a job. And that's because there are other things connected with just having a job. And one is the sense of fulfillment, the fact that we relate to others, to our peers, and we look for them, and we look at them for a sense of fulfillment and status. If you don't have a job, in the eyes of your friends, of your peers, you are somebody who's basically being a leech to society. You're not making a useful contribution. If they ask you, what do you do? And you say, well, I study by myself when I'm an independent researcher. And then they say, so basically you just sit on the couch doing nothing. That's a kind of idea that gets through. And so having a job is, as much as an activity that you do every day, a social status proposition. And that is connected with basically everything else that gives you a sense of self-worth and esteem. However, work is, and I think I mentioned this particularly at the end of the chapter on happiness and on, yes, when I speak about flow. So being in a state of flow is actually what makes somebody feel worthy. The feeling that you are doing something, you are engaged, fully engaged in doing something that gives you purpose. And that is regardless of the fact that you are being paid for what you're doing or you're not being paid. And if you couple with that the fact that most jobs today don't produce any value for society, but they're just there for the sake of conspicuous consumption or just keep the economy growing, then you have a problem. My thesis is we can use our ingenuity, our passions, and our flow, our drive in life to actually do something meaningful, because the same technologies that are displacing human labor can free ourselves, can help us liberate us from the shackles of working for survival. And that is my thesis, which I try to explore in the book. And yes, drive, flow, purpose. Work is merely an enabler of these conditions, not a requirement.
You're listening to the Sea Realm Podcast with your host, KMO.
You are listening to the Sea Realm Podcast. I'm your host, KMO. I'm joined by Federico Pistono. He's the author of Robots Will Steal Your Job, But That's Okay: How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy. Federico, in your book, you make the argument that jobs have been outsourced. At first it was manufacturing jobs, things that could things that could be done cheaper elsewhere. But increasingly, jobs which used to be considered mental work, things that were safe from automation, are falling prey to automation. And that when technology eliminates an entire class of jobs, it does create a new class of jobs. But the new class of jobs are technically sophisticated, and they are mentally and creatively challenging jobs that not so many people are qualified to perform. And also those jobs themselves, there's far fewer of them needed than the class of jobs that have been eliminated. And what's even worse, that sometimes the new class of jobs that are created, it's a short-lived need. Those jobs go away pretty quickly with the advance of technology. And so we've got a couple of choices. I mean, we have an infinite number of choices, really, but broadly speaking, we can adapt either by always trying to create new work for people to do so people can remain engaged, employed, working for money, working for survival, or we can redefine our expectations and come to grips with the reality that very few people in the world are actually needed to provide the food, shelter, clothing, and essential services that society requires.
Yes, that is essentially correct. And so the first approach would be to have everybody on the population basically become a meta learner. So a person who is able to learn how to learn very quickly and ever more quickly, coupled with the creation of new jobs, which in the long term would have to be all knowledge-based. And if put to the extreme, the mercification, so the selling of just about anything, including our experiences, our feelings, our memories, your first kiss, your first, some 75-year-old will want to feel that again. So you sell your memory of your first kiss to someone. So it becomes really creepy when you extend that notion into the future, because that's the only thing you can do. Because when you have, the likelihood of Star Trek replicators, we have instances of those, primitive instances of those with 3D printers now, and they will become essentially a Star Trek replicator in a few years. Then you kind of see, where all you need to do is the periodic element plus energy, which can be easily provided for in a few years, given the advance of technology. Then in order to keep the economy growing, you have to become really creative and get to these extravagant and elaborate new types of jobs. And just, it's a rat race. Nobody can win, or better. There is no way everybody can win. Only a few, and a selected few, which is a smaller and smaller portion of the population, will be able to win this race by going faster and faster every time. And, eventually you hit the hard limit of physics. And the other approach, which I think is more sensible, is to do what some countries are starting to do, like France and Germany. They're saying, look, we exploded production. We are now 50 to 100 times more productive than we were in the 1960s, but we still work 40 hours a week. Why? We should be thinking about how to work less to have the same, instead of work the same to have more. And when I say to have the same, it doesn't mean that we should stop innovation. It means that you have the same amounts of stuff, but you have better quality stuff. You have more efficient stuff. You have stuff that serves you better, but you don't have more and more of useless chunks everywhere, which is basically what most societies are being indoctrinated into believing. So Germany is, proposing 30-hour work week. There are plans to have a 20-hour work week by 2040 in France. These things, they should have happened 20, 25 years ago. And I think the only way that we can move forward is, instead of finding new and creative ways to get everyone a job, how about finding new and creative ways so that people need to work less and less until they need to work the bare minimum for survival so that they can dedicate their lives to something more meaningful. And the initial critique that I receive when I present this argument is, if you take people now and you tell them, I'll give you everything you need, but you don't have to work, then people won't do anything because they're lazy bums and they'll become couch potatoes even more than they are now. And to me, that really is ironic, because the reason people are couch potatoes is because they're working 9 to 5 and because they come home, they are exhausted, they don't have any mental energy left to dedicate to anything meaningful. And so what they do is they watch TV and they sit on the couch. So it's exactly the other way around. Because what you see when people are free to do what they want, and they have a sense of purpose because they've been educated about the possibilities, about the state of technology. When people are left to do whatever they want, and simultaneously they are educated about the possibilities and the thrill of collaborating in new and creative ideas and projects, amazing things happen. Just look at what communities like Kickstarter, Indiegogos are enabling. People coming together and creating interesting and cool projects. The open source community, the Creative Commons community, Wikipedia, all these collaborative group mind projects are the result of the fact that people are not lazy bums who sit around, do nothing. It's the testimony that people are really engaging, interesting individuals who look for things, who start projects, and who collaboratively create amazing pieces of work if they're allowed to. And technology is enabling that feeling and that determination to come true. And this is not a theory, hypothetics. This is not a hypothetical situation anymore. This is proven. We have 15 years of data to demonstrate that this is possible. And we have the Linux kernel, the hundreds of millions of web pages created collaboratively through Wikipedia, the Creative Commons movement, open source ecology. So not just culture in terms of texts, video, audio, films, but also actual physical stuff, projects that people touch and use with their hands. So anything really that is creative. And so to me, that is really a testimony of what's possible. And the criticism that if people were free to do what they wanted, they wouldn't do anything is just fallacious. And I think history proved that wrong.
You've mentioned Creative Commons a couple times now. The listeners know well that the C-Realm podcast is distributed under an attribution, non-commercial, share-alike 3.0 Creative Commons license, as is your book.
Yes, I believe information should be free. And, even though I spent more than 1 year full-time working on this book, I decided to release it under Creative Commons license to, first of all, it's, I think, unrealistic to believe that you can restrict people from distributing and sharing ideas. And a book, as much as a film, is basically an idea put into text, put into bits. It's the same thing. So to prevent people from sharing that, I think it's just very myopic and it's silly. At the same time, you can prevent them from making a buck out of it. So you say it's free to distribute freely, but if you want to resell it, you can't. You have to ask permission to the author. And so the book is in Creative Commons, it's free to share. And starting next week, I'll start actually publishing the book on the website for free, with, starting from the first chapter and then every week or every other week publishing a new chapter until the end of the book. And obviously I'm just a drop in the ocean, because I was inspired by many other authors who do exactly the same. Lawrence Lessig, Clay Shirky, Cory Doctorow, all these amazing people that have preceded me have inspired me to follow their steps. And I hope in turn to inspire other people to do it the same.
You mentioned there is this perception that if people are not required to work, that they will just sit on the couch and eat bad food and get fat and really disgusting. And if you go to YouTube and you type in people of Walmart, you will find loads of videos of images of people, just snapshots taken with phones and such at Walmart of really obese people dressed in absurd clothing. They seem just really damaged and degraded and, as my friend Jim Kunstler would say, demoralized. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we have basically taken all or as much human labor out of agriculture as possible and automated it as much as possible, or at least put it under the mechanized control of very few people. And that what this has done is given us a diet which is based primarily on the manufactured products that come from a few grain crops, wheat, soybeans, corn, just a very few variety of things which can be planted, fertilized, tended, harvested, transported, broken down into their constituent fractions, recombined, and put into a box or a package on a store shelf, which has a very long shelf life, but has very little nutritive value. And a lot of the people that you see in those videos, I think, are already unemployed because our unemployment figures and the way that we measure them are constantly being rejiggered or reformulated so as to minimize or distract from the reality that fewer and fewer people are needed to keep this economy working, and more of them are in this position where they don't spend their days working. They spend their days sitting on the couch or in front of the computer, on Facebook or watching television, and eating really bad food. And one of the things that you advise in terms of getting happy and putting yourself in a good position to weather the coming economic storms is to grow your own food, or at least some of it.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned many things. One of them is the mechanization allowed for these types of people to actually exist, which never happened in the history of humanity, or at least in the recorded history. The thing is, it's always coupled with the cultural element. Technology by itself doesn't do anything to anyone. It's how you use the technology. So you have to couple that with the zeitgeist of a particular society. For instance, in Europe and in most of Asia, that never happened. You don't see extremely obese people at the supermarket going around with those mechanized trolleys because they can't even move themselves, move their bodies around. There are simply no people like that. And I can speak for experience, and by looking at the statistics, in Italy, the amount of people who are obese is extremely low. It's as little as a few percent or a fraction of that. Certainly, orders of magnitude less than the United States. And the reason for that is, well, first of all, in Italy, we have a really good culture for food, about food, and about where does food come from? Is this food healthy? The culture of eating regularly together, communally, a meal, families eat twice a day. Everybody eats together at the same time around the table. And that is simply not a habit in the whole of the United States. I know many people who, eat when they can. They eat junk food. They eat continuously. And this just doesn't happen in Europe. And the reason is mostly cultural. So that is one of the things that permeates every argument that I'm making. There is always the cultural element to be thought about. And that is one of the mistakes that technologists most of the times do. For instance, Dean Kamer just came out with this absurd patent, and only an American could do that, to basically insert a straw inside your intestine so that they can suck out the food regularly, daily, so you can eat as much as you want, and you don't have, and without even throwing up, you never get fat. Now, this is only an American thing. I mean, I want our viewers to kind of think about the differences in culture between the United States and the rest of the world. The problem of obesity is Anglo-Saxon. So the United States, partially the UK, and that's it. Almost no one else has this problem. And by reconnecting with the idea of where does food come from, how does food originate, is this good food, is this not good food, if you grow your own food, it's one of the ways that you can, first of all, reduce your dependency on multinational corporations. Secondly, you become more attached with, your family, your community, because once you grow food, you become interested in food, you eat more healthy, and then you share food with your neighbor, with your friends, who they have apples, you have, peas and potatoes, and it just creates a whole ecosystem that is beneficial for your life. So we shouldn't look at things in a straightforward, mechanicistic way. If you grow your own food, it's not for the purpose of growing food by itself. It's about the whole culture around the creation of food and consumption of food. So I think I made my point.
Well, I certainly agree. I live in a one-bedroom, fifth-floor apartment, and I don't have access to any place to grow food, but my uncle, who lives about a half-hour's drive away, he's got a house and a backyard, and he's devoted the whole of his backyard, or almost all of it, to his garden. And what I love about gardening is that it really connects you to the time of year. You're very conscious, and your activities and your diet all change and reflect the time of year, whereas if you stand in front of a computer editing audio all day or recording Skype conversations, it doesn't really matter what time of year it is. Maybe the window's open, maybe it's not, but that's about all. And in so much of the industrial world, in the industrial first world, if it's warm outside, you've got the air conditioning on. So it doesn't matter what time of year it is. It's always the same temperature. You're always engaged in the same activity, and your diet is always the same, because what you eat is not so much a matter of, what's available at that time of year. It's just what habits you have established when purchasing food at the store.
Oh yes, you're making an excellent point. Now it reminds me. I don't remember if it's exactly this percentage, but I have to check on the data. But I think as much as 50% of all the calories that we ingest are used just to keep our body temperature stable. So if you artificially keep 22 Celsius in your room all the time, then you need only so many calories to keep your body warm. Therefore, ingesting the same amount of food will make you fatter. And this is thermodynamics. It's as simple as, how much stuff gets in, how much stuff goes out. So the fact that we have these artificial environments that are always stable at the same temperature is not healthy, because we haven't evolved with these characteristics. So of course we can, re-engineer our bodies to conform to this new status. But I think, of course it can be done, but should we do it? Maybe, maybe not, maybe in time. I just think we should take a more sensible approach, and of course you shouldn't wear freaking 5 sweaters during winter, but if you have a few degrees less during winter in your house and a few degrees more during the summer, I don't think it's unreasonable. I think it's actually very reasonable, and it lets you connect with nature, with what's outside. And also when you get outside, you don't get a cold, or you don't get because of the sudden exchange of heat. that is very rapid, and your body maybe may not respond in a very good way. So we kind of shielded ourselves from nature as more technology became available. Just because something can be done, it doesn't mean that it has to be done. So my proposition is that we should think about what we are doing and not just go with the flow and think that it's inevitable. And that is really the purpose of my next book, which is a sci-fi novelette called A Tale of Two Futures. And it tells the story of an average day in life in two very different futures, a few decades from now. One where things have just gone with the flow by inertia. So people have continued in the path that society is on the path now without really taking any major steps towards a certain direction, followed by their goals, their motivations, their intuitions about what's right. And they've just gone with the flow, worked their jobs, and continued with the economy as in the financial institutions and everything as it is now, just projected 40 years into the future with more technology available, which is available for us and for the establishment. And that future, I can tell you now, little spoiler, is not going to be pretty. The other future is where the open source, the collaboration, the idea of community and sharing of ideas and repurposing our lives has taken over. And I show how a normal and average day in life of that kind of future can be as opposed to the other. And they have equal opportunity, equal probability starting today, but they have very, very different consequences. So I hope that with this novel, I can inspire people to make the right choices and move toward the best direction.
When will that be published?
Very soon. I'm actually 85-90% done with the first draft. So it's a matter of finishing it up and then polishing it. Maybe a couple of months.
Well, I hope I can get an advance copy.
Obviously.
You're listening to the Zero Podcast. Blowing your mind 1 week at a time.
That was Federico Pistono, the author of Robots Will Steal Your Job, But That's Okay: How to Survive the Economic Collapse and Be Happy. You can read Federico's book for free on his website. I'll post a link to his website in the show notes for this episode, which you can find on crealm.com. The music in the middle was provided by AU5. The song is called Singularity. Thanks again to Adapted Records for permission to play the music of AU5. Before I go, I want to invite the C-Realm listeners in and around New York City to an event that Olga and I will be attending on March 14th, 2013. You have heard both Dennis McKenna and Douglas Rushkoff here on the C-Realm podcast, and now you have the opportunity to see them both at the same live event. Evolver NYC and the C-Realm podcast present Present Shock and the Psychedelic Legacy of Terence McKenna, an evening with Dennis McKenna and Douglas Rushkoff. The event will take place in the theater at Riverside Church, which is at 91 Claremont Avenue at 120th Street in Manhattan. Again, the event takes place on March 14th and starts at 7 p.m. Advance tickets are $20 and seating is limited, so if you'd like to attend this event, go to crealm.com and look in the show notes for this episode and you'll find a link where you can buy tickets. That is all for this installment of the C-Realm podcast. The conversation with Federico Pistono continues on this weekend's episode of the C-Realm Vault podcast. And you can hear Olga, Marty, and me in new weekly episodes of the Z-Realm podcast. Marty will also be joining us for this month's episode of the Psychonautica podcast, and we'll be talking about hippie exploitation films of the late 1960s. On next week's episode of the C-Realm podcast, I will share a conversation that I recorded just recently with James Hughes. He's the founder of the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technology. I hope you will join me for all of those conversations, and until we next meet here in Cyberdelic Space, I hope that you will stay well.